The village constable, Mr. Hartwell, arrived within the hour, a methodical man of some 50 years whose career had been distinguished primarily by the absence of serious crimes in his jurisdiction, a distinction he wore with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed that proper policing was largely a matter of prevention through presence. He surveyed the study with the careful attention of one suddenly confronted with a situation that fell decidedly outside his ordinary experience, his notebook clutched in his hand as though it might provide answers to the questions he had not yet quite formulated. The Scotland Yard inspector would be summoned, Hartwell explained to the assembled household. But in the meantime, he would take preliminary statements from all those present at Thornfield Manor that afternoon, a process that began with Mrs. Thornfield herself, conducted in the drawing-room under conditions that attempted, without great success, to maintain the fiction of civilized formality. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the window where she had resumed her seat with admirable composure, watched the sequence of events unfold with the interest of someone settling down to a particularly well-constructed puzzle. Edmund Thornfield was questioned early, and his account of discovering Miss Ashworth proved straightforward enough. He had been concerned when she did not return to the parlor, as she had mentioned only brief correspondence to attend to, and so he had ventured to the study to inquire whether she required assistance with anything. The door had been half open, and upon pushing it wider, he had discovered her in that terrible condition. His voice wavered slightly at this recollection, and his hand trembled as he described the moment of realization. Yet his account contained no discrepancies, no hesitations that might suggest the construction of an elaborate falsehood. When Constable Hartwell inquired about the scratch on his hand, Edmund glanced down with apparent surprise, as though seeing it for the first time, and explained readily that he must have acquired it while working in the garden that very morning, a perfectly reasonable explanation that neither the constable nor anyone else seemed inclined to question further. Dr. Hartley provided the medical assessment. Miss Ashworth had been dead for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, struck from behind with considerable force, the blow delivered by someone of at least average strength, though not necessarily great physical power. The marble bookend bore traces consistent with having inflicted the wound, and the window's recent disturbance suggested that someone had attempted, or perhaps merely wished to suggest, that an intruder had accessed the study from outside, though this seemed unlikely given the height of the study from the ground and the absence of any disturbance in the flower beds beneath. The question of motive and opportunity began to occupy the collective thoughts of those assembled, and in the absence of any obvious external explanation, suspicion naturally turned inward toward the household and its guests. The vicar tactfully inquired whether Miss Ashworth had possessed enemies, and Mrs. Thornfield, recovering some degree of composure, revealed that Miss Ashworth had been in her employ for the past 8 years, that she had been efficient, discreet, and, as far as Mrs. Thornfield knew, entirely without complications or antagonistic relationships. Yet there was something in the way Mrs. Thornfield delivered this assessment that suggested either incomplete knowledge or a deliberate omission of pertinent information, a hesitation that Miss Marple noted with the attention of someone for whom such behavioral irregularities often proved more revealing than explicit testimony. As the afternoon drew toward evening and the constable's preliminary investigation continued, it emerged that Miss Ashworth had indeed been searching through the desk when she met her end, for the papers scattered about it appeared to have been intentionally examined rather than merely displaced by violence. Miss Pennington, the headmistress, remarked with some asperity that it seemed quite clear the woman had surprised a burglar in the act of theft, a theory that gained currency among those present, as it provided both a logical explanation for the open window and a reassuring distance between the crime and their own small community. Yet Constable Hartwell seemed less convinced, his expression suggesting that the pieces of this particular puzzle resisted the neat arrangement that everyone seemed eager to impose upon them. It was during this period of general speculation and mounting anxiety that Miss Marple, still occupying her chair with the stillness of a woman to whom patience came as naturally as breathing, observed a second significant detail that set her mind working along different pathways than those being pursued by the official investigation. When the Ashford twins were being questioned in sequence, Carolyn had mentioned, quite incidentally in passing, that she had noticed Miss Ashworth seeming somewhat distressed that morning when serving breakfast, and that she had appeared to receive a letter with the second post, a letter that had caused her face to pale considerably. The letter itself was not discovered among Miss Ashworth's possessions, a curious absence that Constable Hartwell duly noted, but seemed to classify as a minor matter compared to the larger architecture of the crime. Yet to Miss Marple's practiced observation, this missing letter suggested that someone present at Thornfield Manor had reason to remove it, that whatever conflict had led to Miss Ashworth's death had its roots not in random thievery, but in something far more personal and deliberate. As the evening descended and the household settled into an uneasy state of shock and conjecture, Miss Marple excused herself to retire early, claiming the emotional toll of the day's events, and withdrew to her guest room with her embroidery. Though her needlework received considerably less attention than the patterns of human behavior she was quietly arranging in her mind, patterns that suggested the solution to Miss Ashworth's murder lay not in any examination of physical evidence, but in the careful study of motive, opportunity, and the peculiar ways that ordinary people became capable of extraordinary violence when their carefully constructed lives faced the prospect of sudden public exposure. The morning following Miss Ashworth's death arrived with the sort of brilliant sunshine that seemed almost insulting in its cheerfulness, a natural indifference to human tragedy that Miss Marple had observed countless times throughout her long life in St. Clement's and other villages beyond. Inspector Crabtree of Scotland Yard materialized at Thornfield Manor shortly after 9 o'clock, a man of perhaps 60 with the tired eyes of someone who had investigated too many varieties of human wickedness to maintain much faith in the essential goodness of his fellow creatures. He was thorough and professional, setting up a makeshift office in the morning room and establishing a systematic approach to interviewing each member of the household and the guests who had been present at the garden party. Miss Marple, when summoned for her own interview, presented herself with the diffident manner of an elderly woman keenly aware that she possessed no official standing in such matters, yet possessing considerable curiosity about the tragic event. Inspector Crabtree, examining her with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to identifying the honest from the dissembling, seemed to regard her as a harmless witness of minimal significance, though he did conduct a thorough examination of her movements and observations throughout the afternoon. It was during this exchange that Miss Marple casually mentioned having observed Edmund Thornfield's scratch, a comment delivered with such apparent innocence that the inspector might have dismissed it entirely had he not already begun to perceive certain inconsistencies in the official narrative of the crime. Edmund's account of his morning gardening, when investigated by the inspector's own officer, could not be verified by any of the household staff, a fact that Constable Hartwell felt compelled to report with visible discomfort, as though the disappearance of reliable corroboration represented a personal failure on his part. Moreover, upon more careful examination of the study, Inspector Crabtree discovered that the papers scattered about the desk were primarily concerned with financial matters, household accounts, correspondence with solicitors, and various documents relating to Miss Thornfield's personal estate. The contents suggested that someone had been searching systematically for documents of particular significance, a search that implied considerable knowledge of where such documents might be located. Mrs. Thornfield, when pressed upon the matter, reluctantly admitted that Miss Ashworth had possessed access to various confidential family papers, as her duties as secretary had required her to maintain correspondence and manage certain administrative affairs on behalf of the household. The inspector's questions became increasingly pointed, and the atmosphere within Thornfield Manor grew progressively more tense as the day advanced. By midday, a development of considerable significance emerged when one of the inspector's officers discovered that Miss Ashworth had been engaged to a gentleman named Robert Harrington, a man of modest means employed in the city. that this engagement had been maintained in considerable secrecy, known only to a select few within the household. The Ashford twins, when confronted with this information, admitted that they had known of the engagement but had been sworn to silence by Miss Ashworth herself, who had feared that Mrs. Thornfield might disapprove of the liaison. This revelation opened entirely new avenues of investigation, as the inspector began to consider whether the murder might have been motivated by jealousy or some financial dispute rather than by any matter internal to the Thornfield household itself. Yet Miss Marple, listening quietly to these developments as they were discussed among the household members and servants, noticed something that seemed to escape the notice of the official investigation: the precise timing of the revelation regarding Robert Harrington. The twins had known of the engagement, certainly, but they had disclosed it somewhat reluctantly and only when directly confronted by the inspector's inquiry. This suggested that they possessed reasons beyond mere discretion for maintaining silence, reasons that might relate to something far more significant than simple loyalty to a friend. When Miss Marple encountered Caroline Ashford alone in the library that afternoon, ostensibly searching for a particular novel, she observed the young woman's nervous state with considerable interest and ventured a gentle observation regarding the difficulty of maintaining secrets in small communities. A remark delivered with such apparent sympathy that Caroline's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. In a voice barely above a whisper, Caroline confessed that Miss Ashworth had confided in her regarding certain concerns about financial irregularities within the Thornfield household, concerns that had prompted Miss Ashworth to begin investigating certain documents to verify her suspicions. Caroline had urged her to speak directly to Mrs. Thornfield, but Miss Ashworth had insisted upon complete certainty before making any accusations, a caution that had ultimately, it seemed, proven fatal. Miss Marple received this information with a gentle nod and asked one carefully constructed question. Had Miss Ashworth mentioned to whom these financial irregularities might be traced? Caroline's hesitation before answering provided its own form of eloquence, and when she finally spoke, the name she reluctantly provided was Edmund Thornfield's. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align themselves in Miss Marple's mind with the clarity that came from years of observing how ordinary people became entangled in the consequences of their own choices. Financial desperation, hidden engagement, incriminating documents, and that small scratch upon Edmund's hand. Each element found its place in the larger pattern. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious and aware that certainty based upon inference alone could prove deceptive, resolved that she required one additional piece of evidence before she could speak with any confidence regarding the true nature of the crime. The missing letter, she suspected, contained the key to understanding precisely why Miss Ashworth had died that afternoon, and that letter, she was increasingly convinced, remained somewhere within the boundaries of Thornfield Manor, awaiting discovery by someone patient enough to search for it. The evening of that same day found Miss Marple seated in the drawing-room with Mrs. Thornfield, who had begun to recover from the initial shock of the tragedy with the resilience of someone accustomed to managing domestic crises through force of will and careful attention to social propriety. The inspector had withdrawn to his temporary quarters to organize his findings, and the household had settled into an uneasy quiet, punctuated by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional murmur of conversation among the servants as they attended to their evening duties. Miss Marple, working steadily on her embroidery with fingers that moved with practiced precision, broached the subject of Miss Ashworth's employment with the gentle circumspection of someone merely making polite conversation rather than conducting an inquiry. Mrs. Thornfield, perhaps grateful for the opportunity to discuss something other than the horrifying events of the previous day, began to speak of her late secretary with a mixture of esteem and exasperation that often characterized employer-employee relationships of long standing. It was during this conversation that Mrs. Thornfield mentioned, quite incidentally, that Miss Ashworth had seemed increasingly distracted over the past several months. and that she had taken to remaining in the study late into the evening, ostensibly working on correspondence, but perhaps, Mrs. Thornfield mused with a sudden note of concern in her voice, pursuing some private matter entirely unrelated to her official duties. This observation, combined with Caroline's earlier revelation regarding financial irregularities, painted a picture of Miss Ashworth as a woman driven by a sense of moral duty to investigate circumstances that troubled her conscience, a woman willing to undertake solitary investigation despite the risks such action might entail. Miss Marple ventured to inquire whether Mrs. Thornfield had noticed any particular changes in Edmund's behavior during this same period, and the older woman's response was immediately informative. Edmund, she explained, had been in considerable financial difficulty, a matter that she and her late husband had attempted to address through various means, including the promise of assistance from the family estate once certain legal matters were settled. However, Edmund's difficulties had proven more severe than initially apparent, and there had been discussions, uncomfortable discussions, regarding the possibility that Edmund might be asked to relinquish his expectations regarding the inheritance in exchange for a substantial payment that would discharge his debts. This revelation suggested a motive of considerable weight, and Miss Marple understood immediately why Miss Ashworth's investigation of the household finances had assumed such critical importance. If Edmund had begun to embezzle funds from the Thornfield accounts, attempting to remedy his financial situation through clandestine means, then Miss Ashworth's discovery of such activity would not merely have resulted in his disgrace, but in his complete financial ruin and likely criminal prosecution. That night, after retiring to her guest room, Miss Marple lay awake considering the pattern that had emerged from the scattered fragments of information she had gathered. The missing letter, she was now convinced, had contained evidence or an ultimatum from Miss Ashworth regarding the financial irregularities she had discovered, a letter that had prompted Edmund to confront her in the study with the intention of retrieving it and preventing its contents from reaching Mrs. Thornfield or the authorities. The struggle that had ensued, whether intended or simply the consequence of panic and desperation, had resulted in Miss Ashworth's death. Yet even as Miss Marple constructed this narrative in her mind, she recognized that it remained, at its foundation, a theory rather than established fact, and she was acutely aware of the danger inherent in allowing a plausible explanation to substitute for genuine certainty. The following morning brought a development that seemed to confirm her suspicions while simultaneously introducing new complications into the investigation. Inspector Crabtree summoned the household to the drawing room and announced that his officers had discovered evidence of embezzlement within the Thornfield accounts, a systematic pattern of withdrawals and falsified entries that extended back nearly 2 years. The amounts involved were substantial enough to account for Edmund's financial difficulties and to establish him as possessing an extremely powerful motive for silencing anyone who threatened to expose his crimes. Edmund's face, when confronted with this accusation, displayed a remarkable sequence of expressions: shock, denial, then a sort of resigned acceptance that suggested the weight of accumulated guilt finally overwhelming the capacity for sustained deception. Yet when Inspector Crabtree produced the evidence more specifically and pressed Edmund regarding his movements on the afternoon of the murder, something unexpected occurred. Edmund, with what appeared to be genuine distress, insisted that while he had indeed embezzled funds, he had not killed Miss Ashworth, that when he had encountered her in the study that afternoon, she had been already dead, lying upon the floor exactly as the household would subsequently discover her. His hand, he explained, had been scratched not in a struggle with Miss Ashworth, but earlier that morning when he had deliberately cut himself in a moment of despair, a self-inflicted wound that bore no relationship to the crime. Inspector Crabtree regarded this claim with the skepticism it deserved, yet something in Edmund's manner suggested a desperation born of telling the truth rather than the crafted performance of someone attempting to construct a convenient alibi. Miss Marple, observing this exchange with the keen attention she brought to all human interactions, recognized that they had arrived at that critical juncture in any investigation where the obvious solution, while superficially satisfying, began to reveal troubling inconsistencies upon closer examination. If Edmund had not killed Miss Ashworth, then someone else within the household must have done so, someone with equally compelling motives and equal access to the study that afternoon. The puzzle, rather than solving itself, had instead transformed into something considerably more complex, and Miss Marple settled back into her chair with the expression of someone who had anticipated precisely such a development, her mind already turning toward the other inhabitants of Thornfield Manor and their relationship to the dead woman and the secrets she had been investigating. The elimination of Edmund as the perpetrator redirected Inspector Crabtree's investigation with renewed intensity, and he proceeded to reconstruct the movements of each person present at Thornfield Manor during the critical half-hour preceding Miss Ashworth's discovery. Mrs. Thornfield had remained in the parlor throughout, attended by multiple witnesses who could attest to her continuous presence, a fact that effectively removed her from consideration despite her obvious motive regarding the embezzlement. The vicar and his wife had similarly remained in the drawing-room, engaged in conversation with Miss Pennington and the Ashford twins, their alibi secured through the simple fact of collective observation. Dr. Hartley presented a more complex case, as he had briefly excused himself to use the lavatory, though his absence had extended only a few minutes and his movements had been observed by the servant who was attending to refreshments in the corridor. Yet it was the household staff themselves who began to assume greater significance in the Tyna inspector's questioning, particularly the older servants who had worked at Thornfield Manor for many years and possessed intimate knowledge of the family's affairs and resources. It was in this context that Miss Marple made a quiet observation to Inspector Crabtree during a private moment in the hallway, a suggestion delivered with such apparent hesitancy that the inspector might easily have dismissed it had he not recognized the particular quality of insight that seemed to accompany even the most tentatively expressed observations from the elderly visitor. Miss Marple wondered aloud whether the inspector had given considerable attention to the question of who possessed knowledge regarding the location of specific documents within the study, a question that seemed to perplex Crabtree momentarily before he understood its significance. Someone must have known precisely where Miss Ashworth kept her evidence regarding the embezzlement, or at the very least, someone must have possessed sufficient familiarity with the study to search it systematically. This line of reasoning led the investigation toward the household staff with renewed focus, and within hours, Inspector Crabtree had uncovered a significant connection that had been previously overlooked. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Price, a woman of 60 years who had served the Thornfield family for more than 3 decades, had a nephew who had been involved in financial difficulties similar to Edmund's, a nephew for whom she harbored considerable affection and whom she had been quietly assisting financially through means that would not bear close scrutiny. Furthermore, and perhaps more significantly, Mrs. Price had been observed by one of the younger servants on the afternoon in question, moving from the direction of the study toward the servants' quarters at approximately the time Miss Ashworth had presumably met her death. When confronted with this information and questioned regarding her whereabouts, Mrs. Price's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the initial investigation, began to fracture visibly. She admitted that she had seen Miss Ashworth entering the study that afternoon and had followed her with the intention of speaking with her regarding certain matters of household concern. Yet Mrs. Price's account diverged significantly from the accepted narrative when she claimed to have found Miss Ashworth already injured, the result of what appeared to be a fall from the study ladder that stood near the bookshelf. According to Mrs. Price's version of events, she had panicked, uncertain whether to raise the alarm or attempt to assist the injured woman, and in that moment of indecision, Miss Ashworth had expired. The marble bookend, Mrs. Price insisted, had already been displaced from its position before her arrival, a detail that seemed suspicious in its convenience, yet could not be entirely dismissed without investigation. Miss Marple, listening to this account from the doorway of the drawing-room where the interview was being conducted in the presence of Mrs. Thornfield and the inspector, noted several elements that seemed inconsistent with the official explanation, yet could not necessarily be characterized as deliberate falsehoods. Mrs. Price's emotional state appeared genuine, her distress authentic rather than performed, and her account contained sufficient internal inconsistencies to suggest confusion and genuine trauma rather than the carefully constructed narrative of a calculated murderer. Inspector Crabtree, displaying the thoroughness that characterized his investigative method, ordered a detailed examination of the study ladder and the surrounding area, an examination that revealed faint traces of dust consistent with recent disturbance and a small fragment of fabric caught upon one of the ladder's rungs, a fragment that proved upon analysis to match the material of the dress Miss Ashworth had been wearing. Yet even this apparently conclusive evidence created more questions than it resolved. If Miss Ashworth had indeed fallen from the ladder, then how had she come to acquire the wound upon her head that had proven fatal? The positioning of the bookend, the angle of the wound, and the pattern of blood spatter all seemed inconsistent with an accidental fall, yet neither did they precisely match the characteristics one would expect from a deliberate blow delivered by an assailant. Miss Marple, observing the inspector's visible frustration at this juncture, recognized that they had reached a point where the physical evidence had become nearly as misleading as it was illuminating, and that the resolution of the mystery required a form of analysis that exceeded the scope of forensic examination. She excused herself from the gathering with the explanation that the emotional toll of the investigation was beginning to affect her composure, and withdrew to the library, where she spent the remainder of the afternoon in apparent consultation of various volumes from Mrs. Thornfield's collection, though her actual attention remained focused upon the careful consideration of human nature and the various ways that accidents and intentions could become inextricably entangled in the chaotic moments that preceded death. It was during the evening of the fourth day following Miss Ashworth's death that a significant development emerged from a source entirely unexpected, a development that proved to possess implications far exceeding the apparent simplicity of its origin. One of the younger housemaids, a girl of perhaps 18 named Annie Fulton, approached Miss Marple privately in the hallway near her guest room, her manner suggesting the kind of nervous determination that accompanied the decision to breach established hierarchies of discretion and loyalty. Annie, in a voice barely above a whisper, confessed that she had observed something on the afternoon of the murder that she had been reluctant to disclose to the official investigation, a reluctance born of fear regarding the consequences such disclosure might entail. She had seen, she explained, not Miss Ashworth's fall from the ladder, but rather the moments preceding it, moments during which she had witnessed a confrontation between Miss Ashworth and another member of the household. A confrontation that had occurred in the corridor outside the study, and that had involved raised voices and what appeared to be considerable emotional distress on both parties. Annie, terrified of the implications and uncertain of her own position, had remained silent during the official questioning, but her conscience had apparently begun to trouble her sufficiently that discretion had gradually yielded to the demands of honesty. The individual involved in this confrontation, according to Annie's somewhat hesitant description, had been Mrs. Thornfield herself, a revelation that immediately recast the entire investigation in an entirely different light. Miss Marple, displaying admirable composure despite the significance of this information, gently inquired whether Annie possessed any sense of what had prompted the exchange between Mrs. Thornfield and Miss Ashworth, and the housemaid, after considerable hesitation, indicated that she had heard Miss Ashworth mention something regarding letters and the necessity of informing the authorities. When informed of Annie's account, Inspector Crabtree's expression underwent a visible transformation, suggesting that this new information had provided the clarity that had previously been absent from his investigation. He requested an immediate interview with Mrs. Thornfield, conducted in the presence of Constable Hartwell and himself, an interview that quickly assumed the character of a formal interrogation rather than a casual exchange. Mrs. Thornfield, confronted with Annie's testimony and the logical implications thereof, initially maintained her composure with the discipline of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations through sheer force of will. However, as the inspector's questions became increasingly specific and his presentation of circumstantial evidence more comprehensive, her carefully constructed facade began to deteriorate with remarkable rapidity. She admitted, after considerable pressure, that she had indeed encountered Miss Ashworth in the corridor that afternoon, that Miss Ashworth had informed her of the discovery regarding Edmund's embezzlement, and that Miss Ashworth had further indicated her intention to inform the authorities and the legal authorities regarding the financial crimes she had uncovered. Mrs. Thornfield's voice, when she finally spoke the truth, carried the particular quality of exhaustion that accompanies the surrender of long-sustained deception. She had, she confessed, followed Miss Ashworth into the study with the intention of dissuading her from taking such action, arguing that Edmund's crimes might be addressed through private remediation and restitution without the necessity of criminal prosecution. The confrontation had escalated when Miss Ashworth had remained adamant in her refusal to remain silent regarding conduct that she believed constituted a serious breach of both legal and moral obligation. In her distress and frustration, Mrs. Thornfield had gestured emphatically during their argument, and Miss Ashworth, startled by the sudden movement, had stepped backward and caught her heel upon something, losing her footing and striking the study ladder, which had begun to collapse beneath her. Mrs. Thornfield, attempting to catch her, had inadvertently contributed to the woman's fall rather than preventing it, and in the confusion and terror of those moments, Miss Ashworth's head had struck the marble bookend with devastating force. Miss Marple, observing Mrs. Thornfield's account from her position near the window, recognized in the older woman's narrative the particular character of genuine guilt combined with the fundamental truthfulness of someone finally unburdening herself of accumulated deception. Yet she also recognized certain elements that seemed to require clarification. Subtleties that suggested the full truth of what had transpired in the study remained somewhat more complex than Mrs. Thornfield's confession implied. When the inspector seemed prepared to accept this account as essentially complete, Miss Marple ventured a gentle inquiry regarding the missing letter that had so troubled Miss Ashworth that morning, the letter that had prompted her initial investigation, and that neither the police nor the household had subsequently discovered. Mrs. Thornfield's expression underwent a peculiar transformation at this question, suggesting that Miss Marple had identified precisely the element that continued to trouble the narrative and that required explanation. It was Mrs. Thornfield herself who had retrieved the letter from Miss Ashworth's possession in the immediate aftermath of the accident, she admitted, seized by the desperate hope that its disappearance might obscure the nature of Miss Ashworth's investigation and delay the inevitable exposure of Edmund's crimes. She had burned it in the parlor fireplace while the household remained distracted by the discovery of the body, an act of destruction that constituted the final element of her complicity in events that had begun as a tragic accident and had been compounded by subsequent attempts at concealment. Inspector Crabtree exchanged a significant glance with Constable Hartwell, and the nature of the charges being contemplated shifted perceptibly from investigation of murder to consideration of the far more complex question of criminal negligence and subsequent obstruction of justice, questions whose legal resolution would occupy considerable attention in the coming weeks. The confession that emerged from Mrs. Thornfield's lips, while superficially comprehensive in its acknowledgment of her actions, contained within it certain lacunae that Miss Marple's experienced mind recognized as potentially significant, gaps in explanation that suggested either genuine confusion regarding the precise sequence of events or a deliberate omission of details that Mrs. Thornfield deemed either irrelevant or excessively damaging to her own position. When pressed by Inspector Crabtree regarding the exact positioning of Miss Ashworth at the moment she had struck the bookend, Mrs. Thornfield's account became noticeably less precise. Her recollection clouded by shock and distress, she claimed, though the inspector's expression suggested skepticism regarding the selective nature of her memory loss. Miss Marple, observing this exchange with the particular attention she reserved for moments when the official narrative seemed to diverge from the underlying reality it purported to describe, noted that Mrs. Thornfield had failed to adequately explain one critical detail, the positioning of the marble bookend itself, which according to the forensic examination had been approximately 2 feet from the body, a distance that seemed incompatible with Miss Ashworth's head having struck it during a fall from the ladder. Furthermore, the angle of the wound and the nature of Miss Ashworth's injuries, upon closer consideration, appeared more consistent with a deliberately directed blow than with accidental contact, a detail that suggested the narrative of tragic accident might itself constitute a form of deception, whether intentional or born of Mrs. Thornfield's own confused recollection of events conducted in moments of extreme stress and emotional disturbance. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested a private audience with Inspector Crabtree, a conversation conducted in the library, away from the hearing of other household members and the officers who had begun to occupy various rooms throughout Thornfield Manor. She presented her observations regarding the inconsistencies between Mrs. Thornfield's account and the physical evidence with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to offering suggestions rather than assertions, couching her analysis in the tentative language of personal speculation rather than definitive pronouncement. The inspector, displaying the professional respect that he had developed toward this elderly visitor over the course of the investigation, listened with apparent interest to her detailed examination of the chronology and spatial relationships that seemed to undermine the accident narrative. Miss Marple ventured the observation that if one accepted the possibility that Mrs. Thornfield's recollection had been clouded by shock and emotional disturbance, then perhaps the actual sequence of events had been somewhat different from the account she had provided, that perhaps the confrontation regarding Edmund's embezzlement had escalated to a degree that Mrs. Thornfield herself had not fully acknowledged. When the inspector inquired whether Miss Marple was suggesting that Mrs. Thornfield had deliberately struck Miss Ashworth with the bookend, Miss Marple responded with characteristic caution that she was suggesting merely that the evidence seemed to support such a possibility, though she emphasized that she possessed no definitive knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's intentions at the critical moment. The inspector returned to his interview with Mrs. Thornfield with renewed focus, presenting her with the inconsistencies that Miss Marple had identified and watching carefully for her reaction to this more detailed examination of the physical evidence. Mrs. Thornfield's response revealed a gradual erosion of her carefully maintained composure, as though the specific nature of the inspector's questions had penetrated the psychological defenses she had constructed around her own understanding of what had transpired in the study. She admitted, after considerable hesitation and with visible emotional turmoil, that her initial account had been incomplete, that in the moments following Miss Ashworth's fall from the ladder, when she had perceived that the woman was not merely injured but appeared to be dying, she had experienced a moment of desperate action whose precise nature she could scarcely articulate. The marble bookend, she confessed with evident anguish, had still been in her hand when she realized that Miss Ashworth was breathing but barely conscious, and in a terrible moment of confusion between mercy and panic, between the desire to end suffering and the instinct toward self-preservation, she had struck the dying woman once more, a single blow that had completed what the accident had begun. Whether this act constituted mercy-killing or murder, whether it represented the action of a woman driven beyond the boundaries of rational behavior by shock and desperation, or the deliberate elimination of a witness to her son's crimes, remained a question whose resolution would occupy the legal authorities rather than the investigative process. Miss Marple, when informed of this final confession, received the news with the composed gravity appropriate to such a revelation, though her expression suggested neither surprise nor satisfaction at the confirmation of her suspicions. She recognized in Mrs. Thornfield's actions the particular tragedy of someone whose love for her child and desire to protect her family had gradually evolved into complicity in conduct that moral clarity would have rejected immediately. The inspector, satisfied that the investigation had reached its essential conclusion, proceeded with a formal arrest of Mrs. Thornfield on charges relating to the death of Miss Violet Ashworth, charges that would ultimately be adjudicated by the courts with all the procedural formality that English law demanded. Yet as Mrs. Thornfield was led away from the drawing-room, her dignity maintained despite her circumstances, Miss Marple experienced the peculiar melancholy that invariably accompanied the resolution of such cases, that awareness that the identification of a murderer provided no genuine satisfaction when that murderer proved to be a woman driven by desperate love into tragic error. A woman whose actions, however legally culpable, emerged from motivations whose human comprehensibility seemed almost as troubling as the crimes themselves. The days immediately following Mrs. Thornfield's arrest assumed a character of profound and almost palpable sadness that seemed to permeate every corner of Thornfield Manor. A sadness born not merely from the tragedy of Miss Ashworth's death, but from the collapse of the carefully constructed facade that had maintained the household's dignity and social standing within the village of St. Clement's. The legal machinery of justice, having been set in motion, proceeded with the relentless formality that British law demanded, and the preliminary examination before the magistrate revealed the full extent of the complications that Mrs. Thornfield's actions had generated. Complications that extended far beyond the simple fact of Miss Ashworth's death. Edmund, confronted with the reality that his mother's desperate attempt to protect him had resulted in tragedy, experienced a psychological crisis whose severity seemed to exceed the capabilities of those around him to adequately address. He abandoned his initial stance of defensive self-interest and instead assumed the burden of his own culpability with an intensity that bordered upon self-annihilation, insisting upon providing detailed testimony regarding his embezzlement and his knowledge of Miss Ashworth's investigation, as though his explicit acknowledgement of guilt might somehow diminish the weight of his mother's criminality. Inspector Crabtree, preparing the final documentation of his investigation, acknowledged to Miss Marple during a casual conversation that the case, while superficially resolved through the identification and arrest of the perpetrator, possessed an underlying complexity that legal proceedings could scarcely address. The question of whether Mrs. Thornfield's actions constituted premeditated murder or represented something more akin to manslaughter born of desperation and emotional extremity would occupy the courts for months to come, and the verdict, whatever it might ultimately be, would provide no genuine resolution to the moral ambiguities that the case had revealed. It was approximately 1 week following Mrs. Thornfield's arrest that a second development emerged. A development that appeared to validate certain of Miss Marple's more subtle suspicions regarding the precise nature of events in the study on that fateful afternoon. One of the forensic specialists attached to the Scotland Yard investigation discovered, upon more careful examination of Miss Ashworth's clothing, evidence that suggested the sequence of injuries had been somewhat different from what Mrs. Thornfield's confession had implied. The wound upon Miss Ashworth's head that had been inflicted by the marble bookend appeared, upon microscopic examination, to have been delivered with considerable force and with a precision that seemed incompatible with a blow delivered by someone acting in the moment of confused desperation that Mrs. Thornfield's account had suggested. Furthermore, the positioning of the wound and the pattern of blood spatter seemed to indicate that Miss Ashworth had been struck from behind while she was already prone upon the floor, a detail that introduced an entirely new dimension of premeditation into the crime. When Inspector Crabtree presented these findings to Mrs. Thornfield during a subsequent interview conducted at the local jail, she underwent a visible transformation, as though the introduction of medical evidence regarding the precise nature of her actions had somehow fractured the psychological framework within which she had been attempting to understand her own conduct. She admitted, with evident reluctance and only after considerable pressure from the inspector, that her previous account had been incomplete in another critical respect. Miss Ashworth, after striking the ladder and falling, had indeed become unconscious, and in that moment of unconsciousness, Mrs. Thornfield had been seized by a terrible clarity regarding the implications of what would occur should Miss Ashworth survive and subsequently reveal Edmund's crimes to the authorities. The marble bookend, grasped in desperation and confusion, had been employed not in a moment of panicked mercy, but rather in a deliberate, calculated act designed to ensure that Miss Ashworth would not recover consciousness to provide testimony regarding what she had discovered. This revelation transformed the legal characterization of the crime from potential manslaughter to deliberate murder, a transformation that carried profound implications not merely for Mrs. Thornfield's eventual sentencing, but for the moral comprehension of her actions and motivations. Miss Marple, when informed of this development, received the news with a gravity appropriate to such a confirmation of her darkest suspicions, though she expressed no satisfaction at having her analysis of the crime validated through the confession of the perpetrator herself. She recognized in Mrs. Thornfield's actions the particular pathos of someone who had gradually crossed invisible moral boundaries, who had begun with the understandable desire to protect her son from the consequences of his crimes and had ended by committing an act of deliberate murder, whose calculation and premeditation far exceeded the supposed accident that had initially set events in motion. The transformation from desperate mother attempting to shield her child to deliberate murderer had occurred in the space of mere moments. Yet those moments represented a crossing of a threshold from which return seemed impossible, a descent into criminality that no amount of subsequent remorse could adequately address. The village of St. Clement's, in the days following this final revelation, assumed an air of troubled comprehension, as though the community had collectively recognized that the safety and stability it had assumed to be its fundamental characteristics had proven to be illusions, masks concealing darker currents of desperation and moral compromise. The vicar, in his sermon the following Sunday, spoke with unusual gravity regarding the fragility of human virtue and the ease with which ordinary people, driven by desperation and love, could find themselves committing acts whose moral culpability seemed almost secondary to their incomprehensibility. The Ashford twins, having lost their employment as a result of the scandal that had engulfed the household, found themselves the objects of considerable sympathy from the village community, though their status as peripheral participants in the tragedy had not entirely protected them from the taint of association with criminal conduct. Miss Marple, preparing for her eventual departure from St. Clement's and her return to her own cottage, found herself reflecting upon the case with a mixture of sadness and resigned acceptance that accompanied the conclusion of such investigations. Cases whose resolution provided intellectual satisfaction but emotional disturbance. Solutions that answered the question of guilt while simultaneously raising more profound questions regarding the nature of human weakness and the terrible choices that desperation could impose upon even the most respectable and apparently virtuous members of society. The trial of Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield, which commenced some 6 weeks following the formal charges brought against her, became the subject of considerable attention not merely within the village of St. Clement's, but throughout the broader legal and journalistic circles of England, attention that seemed to intensify as the particulars of the case became more widely understood. Miss Marple, having initially intended to depart the village immediately following the resolution of the investigation, found herself persuaded by both Inspector Crabtree and her cousin Laura to remain in order to provide testimony regarding her observations and deductions, a request that she accepted with her characteristic grace despite the emotional toll she anticipated such participation would exact. The courtroom atmosphere, as the trial progressed through its opening statements and the presentation of evidence, revealed itself to be considerably more sympathetic toward Mrs. Thornfield than the severity of her crimes might have suggested, a sympathy born largely from the universal recognition that she had acted, however criminally, from motivations that most individuals could comprehend even as they deplored the actions to which those motivations had led. The prosecution, represented by a seasoned barrister of considerable skill, presented the physical evidence with methodical precision, establishing the trajectory of Miss Ashworth's injuries and the deliberate nature of the blow that had ultimately proven fatal. Evidence that seemed to paint a picture of calculated murder, undertaken with full awareness of its moral and legal culpability. Yet the defense, employing a strategy that sought to establish the context within which Mrs. Thornfield's actions had occurred, rather than denying the fundamental facts of the case, presented testimony from medical experts regarding the psychological effects of extreme emotional stress and parental desperation. Testimony that seemed designed to establish Mrs. Thornfield's diminished capacity for rational judgment at the critical moment, rather than to establish her innocence. It was during the third day of testimony that Miss Marple was called to provide her observations regarding the investigation and her analysis of the evidence that had led to the identifications of Mrs. Thornfield as the perpetrator of the crime. Her examination by the prosecution proceeded with careful attention to the deductions she had made and the reasoning processes that had guided her investigations, questions that she answered with the precision and clarity that had characterized her involvement throughout the case. Under cross-examination by the defense counsel, however, she found herself confronted with a series of inquiries designed to establish the speculative nature of much of her analysis, the extent to which her conclusions rested upon inference and deduction rather than upon direct observation or forensic evidence. The defense barrister, a man of considerable skill in the art of suggesting doubt and alternative interpretations, pressed Miss Marple regarding the certainty with which she could assert that Mrs. Thornfield had acted with conscious premeditation rather than in a moment of panic and emotional confusion. Miss Marple, maintaining her composure with admirable restraint, despite the implicit suggestion that her reasoning might have been flawed, responded that she could speak only to what the evidence seemed to indicate, that the nature of the wound and its delivery seemed more consistent with deliberate action than with panicked response. Yet she acknowledged that questions of intent and consciousness remained ultimately matters for the court to determine rather than for her to definitively establish. The turning point in the trial came during the fourth week when Mrs. Thornfield, despite the counsel of her legal representatives, insisted upon taking the stand in her own defense, a decision that demonstrated either remarkable courage or profound psychological need to confront directly the nature of her actions and her motivations. Under gentle questioning from her own counsel, she provided an account of her state of mind at the moment of Miss Ashworth's fall, describing the panic and desperation she had experienced as she realized that her son's crimes would be exposed and that the family's reputation and financial security would be destroyed. Yet when the prosecution cross-examined her, she found herself confronted with questions designed to establish the deliberateness of her subsequent action, the precise moment at which she had seized the marble bookend and struck Miss Ashworth. Questions whose answers seemed to establish that her actions had not been the product of momentary panic, but rather of conscious decision undertaken in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, time sufficient for rational thought and deliberate choice. The prosecution's closing statement, delivered with considerable emotional power, emphasized that regardless of Mrs. Thornfield's motivations or her emotional state, the law existed precisely to prevent individuals from committing murder in defense of their family's interests, that the protection of property and reputation could never justify the deliberate taking of human life. The defense, in response, appealed to the jury's capacity for compassion and understanding, arguing that while Mrs. Thornfield's actions were undoubtedly criminal, they emerged from motivations that most members of the jury could imagine themselves experiencing under similar circumstances of desperation and maternal love. The jury, after deliberating for 2 full days, emerged with a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder, though their recommendation that mercy be shown at the time of sentencing suggested that they had accepted at least in part the defense's argument regarding the mitigating circumstances that had surrounded the crime. The judge, delivering sentence with visible gravity, imposed a term of imprisonment that suggested recognition both of the severity of the crime and of the unusual circumstances from which it had emerged, a sentence that seemed to acknowledge that while justice demanded punishment, it also permitted recognition of the human weakness that had precipitated the tragedy. Miss Marple, observing the delivery of sentence from her position in the courtroom gallery, experienced the particular complexity of emotions that seemed to characterize her responses to the conclusion of such investigations. Emotions that combined satisfaction at the revelation of truth with profound sadness regarding the human suffering that truth had exposed. The case of Miss Violet Ashworth's death would remain recorded in the annals of criminal justice and legal precedent. Yet the deeper truth of the tragedy, the understanding of how ordinary, virtuous people could find themselves committing acts of terrible darkness when driven by desperation and love, seemed to escape the formal machinery of legal process, and to require instead the kind of personal reflection and moral comprehension that Miss Marple carried with her into her subsequent years. The autumn following Mrs. Thornfield's conviction brought with it a gradual restoration of equilibrium to the village of St. Clement's, though the restoration was of a nature fundamentally altered from the state that had existed before Miss Ashworth's death had disrupted the community's assumed stability. Thornfield Manor itself, stripped of its former mistress and occupied now only by Edmund, who had begun the arduous process of attempting to rebuild his life through employment in a modest accountancy firm several villages distant, assumed an air of melancholy that seemed to permeate its stone walls and shadowed corridors. The scandal that had engulfed the household, while the inevitable focus of village gossip for several weeks following the trial, gradually yielded to the natural human tendency to move beyond tragedy and return to the quotidian concerns that occupied most people's daily existence. Miss Marple, who had extended her stay in St. Clement's somewhat longer than she had initially anticipated, found herself occupying an unusual position within the community, a position that combined the outsider's perspective with the insider's knowledge granted by her involvement in the investigation and her testimony at trial. The villagers, recognizing in her the particular quality of understanding that seemed to derive from her advanced years and her evident capacity for comprehending human nature in its infinite complexity, began to seek her company with a frequency that suggested they intuited that she possessed insights regarding the tragedy that extended beyond what the legal proceedings had officially established. It was during one such conversation, conducted in the garden of her cousin Laura's cottage on an afternoon when the autumn light seemed to transform the familiar landscape into something almost dreamlike in its beauty, that Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the case with greater depth than she had permitted herself to exercise during the pressures of the active investigation and trial. Caroline Ashford, who had visited with the express purpose of discussing matters that continued to trouble her conscience, seated herself beside Miss Marple and ventured the observation that she remained uncertain whether the investigation had truly uncovered the complete truth regarding Miss Ashworth's death, or whether certain elements of the tragedy continued to resist full comprehension. Miss Marple, setting aside her embroidery with the deliberateness that accompanied her shift into modes of serious reflection, responded with characteristic honesty that the investigation had indeed established the fundamental facts of the crime, that Mrs. Thornfield had indeed delivered the blow that had caused Miss Ashworth's death. Yet she acknowledged that the question of what precisely had transpired in the moments preceding that blow, whether it had truly been as calculated as the legal proceedings had suggested, or whether elements of panic and emotional extremity had played a larger role than Mrs. Thornfield's subsequent testimony had indicated, remained ultimately a matter requiring inference rather than certain knowledge. Caroline pressed further, noting that she had been troubled by a conversation she had overheard between Inspector Crabtree and one of his forensic specialists, in which they had discussed certain inconsistencies in the physical evidence that had not been fully explored during the trial. Inconsistencies that suggested Miss Ashworth might have been struck not once, but possibly twice, the second blow potentially being delivered by someone other than Mrs. Thornfield herself. Miss Marple's expression underwent a subtle transformation, suggesting that Caroline had identified precisely the element that had continued to trouble Miss Marple's own analytical processes throughout the investigation, an element that the demands of the legal proceedings and the confession of Mrs. Thornfield had seemed to render largely irrelevant, yet which continued to nag at the periphery of her consciousness. She admitted, with the candor that characterized her conversations with those she had come to trust, that she had indeed identified certain anomalies in the physical evidence that seemed difficult to reconcile with Mrs. Thornfield's account, anomalies that might suggest the involvement of a second party in the events surrounding Miss Ashworth's death. The precise nature of any such involvement remained unclear, however, for the confession and conviction of Mrs. Thornfield had provided sufficient legal resolution to the case that further investigation had not been pursued, and the passage of time had rendered the pursuit of additional truth something less pressing than the establishment of formal culpability. Miss Marple elaborated with considerable care, explaining that she had observed certain behavioral patterns during the investigation that had suggested Edmund's involvement extended perhaps beyond the simple matter of his financial crimes and his mother's knowledge thereof. His initial reaction to the discovery of Miss Ashworth's body had seemed, upon reflection, somewhat calculated in its spontaneity, displaying an awareness of exactly how genuine shock should manifest itself to an observer accustomed to reading such displays. Furthermore, Edmund's hands, examined closely during the investigation, had borne marks and scratches that he had attributed to his morning gardening. Yet the precise nature of those marks had seemed to Miss Marple more consistent with the kind of abrasions one might sustain during a physical struggle than with the scrapes caused by pruning thorns. Whether Edmund had struck Miss Ashworth in the moments following his mother's initial blow, whether his actions had been undertaken with the intention of completing what his mother had begun, or whether they had represented something more akin to panic and desperation in response to witnessing his mother's crime, remained a question that Miss Marple recognized she could likely never definitively answer. The legal system had identified and convicted Mrs. Thornfield, and pursuing further investigations into Edmund's possible complicity would have required either new evidence or explicit testimony from Edmund himself, neither of which seemed likely to materialize at this juncture. Caroline, absorbing this explanation with evident disturbance, seemed to wrestle with the implications of what Miss Marple was suggesting. The possibility that the investigation had perhaps satisfied itself with establishing culpability rather than with uncovering the complete truth regarding the crime. Miss Marple, recognizing the young woman's distress, offered the gentle observation that the pursuit of absolute truth often came into conflict with the practical necessities of legal justice, that the law required the identification of guilt and the imposition of punishment rather than the complete comprehension of all motivations and circumstances that had led to criminal conduct. The case, she suggested, had perhaps been resolved not because all questions had been answered, but because sufficient questions had been addressed to permit the legal machinery to function and to establish accountability for the crime that had shattered the village's tranquility. The winter that descended upon St. Clement's brought with it a peculiar quality of reflection and finality, as though the shortening days and lengthening nights encouraged the kind of introspection that seemed particularly suited to the resolution of outstanding questions and the acceptance of truths that might never receive formal acknowledgment. Miss Marple, who had now extended her visit to nearly 4 months, found herself preparing for her eventual departure with the mixed emotions that accompanied the conclusion of chapters in one's life. Chapters that had introduced complexities and revealed depths of human nature that simple observation from a distance could never have provided. It was during the final week before her planned return to her own cottage that Edmund Thornfield, who had maintained a careful distance from Miss Marple throughout the trial and its aftermath, appeared unexpectedly at the door of her cousin's residence with an expression that suggested he had been struggling with an internal conflict of considerable magnitude. Once seated in the quiet of the drawing-room, with Laura discreetly withdrawing to permit privacy, Edmund began to speak with the halting articulation of someone who had been rehearsing a confession without ever quite achieving certainty regarding whether the confession should be made at all. He admitted, with visible emotional disturbance, that Miss Marple's suggestions regarding his possible involvement in the moments immediately following Miss Ashworth's fall had not been entirely inaccurate, that he had indeed witnessed at least a portion of what had transpired in the study, and that his actions in response to what he had observed had not been limited to the simple discovery of the body that he had reported to the authorities. Edmund explained that he had followed his mother into the study out of concern regarding her evident emotional disturbance at Miss Ashworth's mention of financial irregularities, that he had arrived moments after Miss Ashworth had fallen from the ladder, and while his mother stood over her with the marble bookend in hand. He had, he confessed with evident shame, assumed in that terrible moment that his mother intended to complete what the accident had begun, that she was about to strike the injured woman, and in his panic and confusion, he had attempted to wrest the bookend from his mother's grasp. In the struggle that had ensued, the bookend had fallen, and it was in retrieving it from the floor that he had acquired the scratches and abrasions that had so troubled Miss Marple's observations. Whether his mother had already delivered the final fatal blow before his arrival, or whether that blow had been delivered in the course of their struggle remained, Edmund insisted, unclear to him even now, the confusion and shock of those moments having rendered his recollection unreliable and fragmented. What Edmund did know with certainty was that when he had finally secured the bookend and stepped back from his mother, Miss Ashworth had been lying motionless upon the floor, her wound grievously severe and her chances of survival clearly minimal, if not non-existent. His mother had been weeping, he recalled, genuine tears of horror and remorse. And in that moment, Edmund had made the decision that would define the remainder of his existence, the decision to protect his mother by remaining silent regarding his presence in the study and his attempted intervention. Miss Marple listened to this confession with the grave attention she brought to such revelations, her expression revealing neither judgment nor surprise, though her mind was clearly engaged in the process of reconciling this new information with the evidence she had observed and the conclusions she had reached during the investigation. She inquired gently whether Edmund had informed his legal representatives of his involvement in the events surrounding Miss Ashworth's death, and when he admitted that he had not, she pressed him regarding his reasons for choosing to remain silent despite the opportunity to provide evidence that might have affected the legal proceedings and the severity of the sentence his mother had received. Edmund's response revealed a complexity of motivation that seemed to combine genuine filial love with the kind of moral confusion that inevitably accompanied complicity and concealment, however passive that complicity might be. He had remained silent, he explained, because he recognized that the truth would have accomplished nothing beyond providing grounds for additional criminal charges against his mother, that his testimony regarding his attempted intervention would likely have been interpreted by the prosecution as evidence of his mother's deliberate and premeditated intent, rather than as evidence of mercy or desperation on her part. Furthermore, he had feared, with what seemed to him at the time a justifiable apprehension, that any revelation of his presence in the study might have resulted in charges against himself regarding obstruction of justice or accessory conduct. Miss Marple, responding to this explanation with a particular quality of understanding that seemed to characterize her approach to human weakness and moral compromise, offered the observation that Edmund had essentially chosen to sacrifice nothing of genuine significance in exchange for the comfort of his own innocence in the eyes of the law, that his silence had permitted him to maintain a position of technical blamelessness while simultaneously allowing his mother to bear the full weight of culpability for actions in which he had at minimum been aware and in which he had possibly been complicit. Edmund's response to this gentle condemnation was immediate and devastating in its acknowledgement of truth, and he found himself weeping with the kind of profound emotional release that seemed to accompany the breaking down of carefully constructed psychological defenses. Miss Marple, moved by his distress, yet unwilling to offer false comfort or absolution for conduct whose moral culpability she could not herself deny, suggested instead that the path forward required not the reopening of legal proceedings, which would serve no constructive purpose at this juncture, but rather a genuine commitment to living a life of integrity and responsibility that might, over the passage of years, constitute some form of meaningful restitution for the harm that his family's actions had caused. Edmund departed some hours later with an expression that suggested the burden of concealment had been replaced by a different burden, that of knowing that his complicity, however passive, in the concealment of truth had left marks upon his soul that no amount of subsequent virtue could entirely erase. Miss Marple, watching his departure from the window, recognized in his anguish the particular tragedy of young people who found themselves forced by circumstance to participate in adult corruption before they had developed the moral frameworks necessary to resist such participation effectively.